Hey everyone, I'm Joe Brady, and today we're going to dig a little bit deeper into some tools and techniques to get the best digital capture possible. When that happens, this allows you to produce an image that reflects the beauty that caused you to stop and capture the scene in the first place. Today's webinar is sponsored by Sekonic, our thanks to them, and, well, by one of my little favorite tools, Sekonic 758 DR meter, and we'll see this in action in a bit. Now, in our last session, I introduced some metering techniques for landscape photography. What we're going to do today is go into a little bit more detail to help us accomplish a goal that, as landscape photographers, we all share. We want to capture the best possible digital file so that our images can be accurately reproduced and shared. Now, towards that end, we're going to look at some different approaches and methods to metering that are going to vary depending on the scene in front of us and the elements that are important to us in that final image. We're going to look at both incident and reflected spot metering. Both methods are extremely useful and sometimes can be the most effective when they're used together. So let's review. First of all, incident meters. Well, incident meters are the simplest and most direct way to determine exposure. Because an incident meter measures the light that falls on the subject, they provide camera settings that render the image exactly the way it appears. Whites are whites, blacks are blacks, grays are grays. In short, an incident reading finds the middle of the scene. Now, spot metering is a method of reflective light metering that can provide a lot of useful information about the highlights and the shadows. In other words, the edges of the photograph. Where incident metering gives you that middle, spot metering then lets you know where those edges are. And this is critical information for any landscape photographer. A couple of weeks ago, I took a trip to a nearby state park that had a lot of great photography spots. Now, because of the dense forest, the waterfalls, and the lakes, these were exactly the types of locations that can give your in-camera meter fits. So let's start out by heading out into the field and take a look at first using our meter in its incident mode. Take notice of something I'll mention early on. The first thing you should do when you arrive at your shooting location is evaluate the light. Look around and see what's going on. Let's take a look. We found a beautiful spot here for doing some more metering and trying to figure out what's going to be the best exposure for landscape and how to have the meter give you that information. If you look behind me here, not a lot going on as far as light goes, and that's really the first thing you need to do. Look at the scene, see what the light is doing. Now I look behind here, there's a little bit of dappled sunlight off in the woods, but in general, you can tell with your eyes, there's not a lot of tonal range in the scene. And honestly, your camera on its matrix metering setting, if you're shooting a landscape over in that direction, is going to do a fine job. There's no really deep shadows, there's no really bright highlights. The camera's going to put everything kind of in that middle gray, and it's really going to work. Look in the other direction though, and we'll turn around and see that in a second. It's a very different situation. So I'm standing here in shade, a little bit of dappled sunlight coming through the trees, but not much. Off in the distance, we have a beautiful waterfall coming down a cliff face, and it is in sun. So now we've got water falling that's going very close to white. So let's discuss a little bit how to approach metering in this kind of situation. Now, when I'm in full shade and I'm going to do an incident meter reading, this will work with every meter. I have my ISO set for 400 because I want to have a lot of depth of field here. I'm at 160th of a second. In this case, I really can just hold the meter out and take my reading. And that's going to be it. It's going to give me a perfect middle reading. In this case, I got 5.6. But I do have to make sure that the sun isn't actually hitting the meter. Because if I do, the sun is actually hitting the dome as it gets higher in the sky, it's going to skew my reading. Now, I haven't been completely clear about that in the past sometimes. If I'm doing a sunrise, I will often just take my meter reading flat out, parallel to the ground, and get a great reading. But as the sun rises and you start to get a bright dot on the sphere here, that can skew the reading. So if I just come over here and take a reading, let's see if I can get the sun to hit the dome, and it goes from 5.6 to 7.1. So that's 2/3 of a stop difference from me stepping a foot apart. So which is the correct reading? Well, the 5.6 is. that little bit of sun hitting the dome is skewing the reading. So if you find yourself in that situation, two choices: either meter with the dome away from the sun in this case, and it's going to give me back to my 5.6, or if I want to have a reading out here, just make sure that specular sun isn't actually hitting the dome. So I'm going to put the dome right in the sun here, and it's kind of going in and out of trees. It just went down to 6.3. So now we're only a third of a stop apart. Really, a third of a stop isn't going to make a difference. But if I can get the sun to come through there, we're back to 7.1. Really, the only thing I need to do is just hold my hand up. I'm kind of far away from the dome, but I'm looking, I can see the little specular highlight on the dome. I just bring my hand up until it casts a shadow over that specular highlight, take my reading, and look at that, I'm back to 5.6. So 5.6 is really the true amount of light that is hitting this spot. Seeing that specular light hitting the dome is skewing it up to 2/3 of a stop. When we go out in bright sun, it's going to be even more so. So you need to learn how to meter, understand what elements are going to affect it. But in this case, again, I'm mostly in shade, a little bit of dappled sun. An incident reading is going to be great, again, because there's no extremes in tonal range around me. Just remember, if you see that bright dot on your dome, just bring your hand up so it just blocks the sun from hitting the dome, get your reading, and you get a perfect result. All right, we're back. So you can see from that scene, at least the area behind me, you could tell that it was not an area that had an extreme tonal range. It was actually relatively narrow, and that's a perfect time to go ahead and use incident metering. Now, a couple questions first. Someone asked, how do you meter for snow or bright sand? Good question, and actually, I'm going to show you that in just a minute. But that's where I'm going to go ahead and use spot metering. I want to take that reading, find out that edge, and again, that's why spot metering is. I'm going to put that white as far off to the right or as far at the highlight as possible without clipping it, and that's where the spot meter, and on the 758, and there's even ways to do it on your camera, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Someone asked about what if you have a meter, like this person has a Sekonic 358, what's the workaround when you need a spot reading, but this isn't a feature of that particular meter? Two answers. One, there is a reflected spot meter attachment you can get from Sekonic. It's on their website. And the other answer is that you can go ahead and use the spot meter in your camera, preferably with a little bit longer lens. Because as you get with a telephoto lens, then the spot is getting narrower, and we're going to cover that a little later as well. Another question was, can you use rechargeable batteries in the light meter? And absolutely, there's no problem with that. This takes those just fine. And let's see. Someone asked if in a situation where shades of green are all around, should I also worry about the quality and the color of the light? It is true that different colors record differently into your camera because each color kind of has its own response in gray, and you almost have to learn how to think and see in black and white. But if I'm in color and I'm worried about the color of the light, then I'm going to do something like bring out a color checker passport, and I'm going to take a shot of this in the scene, and this would allow me to create a custom camera profile for that scene that even though there's lots of greens and lots of light reflecting all over the place, with that green tint to it, this will correct for that. So more a color question for me than a metering question. And then last question before we continue on, someone said, what if I'm in the shade but the subject's in full sunlight? Should incident light metering work in this situation, or should I use spot? That's a really good question. If you are in the shade and your subject is in the sun, then doing an incident meter reading in the shade isn't really going to help, and that's more of a spot metering question. For me, whenever there's any kind of brightness in the scene, really bright clouds, snow, sand, that type of aspect where I'm going to have a very bright piece in my scene, then it's always going to be spot metering, and we're going to see that in a little bit. Now, someone asked, how can I meter for the shutter speed, not the aperture? Last question, very easy. The meter, there's two incident metering modes and spot metering modes. Do you want the shutter speed or the aperture to change? And they're just quick features. It's just a matter of clicking the dial one more time. Now, as we've just talked about, there are times when incident metering may not be the best answer. This frequently happens, well, two reasons. One, you're in shade, your subject's in sun. The other time is if you have a very high contrast scene with very bright highlights that you need to safely capture without danger of losing any of those details. Now, when we switch to spot metering, we're now talking about reflected light. It's coming off of the subject. Now, both the camera's spot meter and the 758 can do that. Reflected light metering tells you about the subject because it's measuring the light coming off of it. And because of that, whichever mode you use in your camera, for example, be it matrix or center weighted, or spot mode on the 758 or in the camera, that information still needs to be evaluated. You need to look at it and figure out where in the scene it needs to go. Now, with digital photography, keeping your highlights from clipping or blowing out is almost always something you want to avoid. Now, you might think that simply turning on the highlight warning in your camera is going to protect this from happening, but that information, while helpful, is keeping you from getting the most out of your camera. Now, there are several reasons why this method is less than perfect. First of all, the highlight alert isn't particularly accurate, and it comes on way before you actually clip. And it also comes on if just one of the three color channels, red, green, and blue, gets close to that upper limit. Secondly, this warning is a JPEG. It's the warning from the JPEG, and on top of that, it's with whatever picture style is currently selected in your camera. The histogram and highlight alert aren't even reading the data from your raw file. Now, you might ask here, well, can I use my camera's spot metering capabilities to find the best exposure? And the answer is yes. It is another tool that can come in very handy. We're going to see another way to take advantage of your camera's metering in just a little bit. When you're using your camera's spot metering, remember that it varies depending on the focal length of your lens. If you use a wide lens, then the area used for that spot metering can get pretty wide and start to render it kind of almost useless. If you put a long telephoto on, then that spot gets much narrower. These limitations are just a couple of reasons to take a really closer look at really what's the ultimate meter for landscape photographers, the Sekonic 758DR. What I love about this meter is it combines the best of both worlds. It has incident and spot metering in one meter, actually two separate sensors, along with calculation tools to give you the information for that perfect exposure. When I'm on location and I have a high contrast scene in front of me with bright elements such as white clouds, beach sand, snow, then I use the spot meter to give me that edge number. I'll then let the meter to tell me how to get the best exposure from that reading. We'll talk about how that happens a little bit more in just a minute. But let's go back to the same park. Again, it's Minnewaska State Park near New Paltz, New York. And let's just turn around and look at a scene where I am in shade, but the subject I'm going to shoot is in bright sun. So now I've got a different situation out here behind me. I've got the falls in the sun. It's a beautiful day. It's very variable, however. We've got partly cloudy skies, maybe even mostly cloudy, and there's patches of blue sky that the sun's appearing through and really changing the exposure a lot. So what's the answer when you want to meter this kind of scene? A couple different ways to do it. I am kind of almost in the same light as the falls now. I could come out into the sun, just shade the dome from the sun and get my meter reading. And let's see, it gives me 11.2. So let's just remember that number a second, because my favorite way to do this kind of shot is to use a spot meter. Now I'm going to turn it on spot, and what I'm after is I'm going to scan around the scene to see what's the absolute brightest spot in the scene. So I'm just going to hold in my measure button and scan around, go up into the clouds, and the brightest reading I get is f25 at 160th of a second. Now remember, if I use that number, that would put those white clouds as middle gray. Well, that's not what I want. But it's extremely important to protect those clouds and the highlights on the waterfall from blowing out. I need to keep a little bit of data in there. And that's where opening up 2.5 stops from that reading will do that. How do I know this? I've done programs before using the DTS software. I've actually loaded a calibration for my Sony Alpha 99 into the meter, so my meter knows what this camera thinks middle gray is. It also knows its tonal range. So I've set my ISO 2 button to 2.5, which is immediately going to give me that 2.5 stops difference. So again, I get my brightest reading, and I actually got a little brighter. I got f32. Holding the ISO 2 button, and it comes back with f13. What that's going to do is put this scene as far to the right in the histogram, expose it as high as it can without clipping any of these white highlights, and that to me is the absolute most important thing. So our reading before was f11, if I remember right, so we're only talking, what is that, 1/3 of a stop. So in this case, the same kind of metering method worked. And it's partly because the sun is behind clouds right now. So the tonal range of the scene is not extreme. We're going to be out in bright sun a little bit later, and we're going to have the sun causing dark shadows and very bright highlights. So for that, we'll definitely go with just the spot metering. Let me try that one more time. So I look at the brightness of the falls. I'm getting f16. I come up to the sky. I'm getting f29. That's about the brightest I'm seeing right now. So I'll take that f29 and I'll put that in my meter, holding the ISO 2 button, f13 at 160. And there's my perfect exposure. And really, that's how simple it is. By doing that, I'm protecting the highlights. And that's critical for landscape photography. It's putting those highlights right at the right without clipping them and giving me the best tonal range in the scene that is possible. All right, as you can probably guess, we had a fun time that day. It was just a gorgeous day to walk around and photograph the waterfalls. A couple more questions. First of all, if you change the battery, do you need to recalibrate the meter? The answer to that is no. The meter does have its own memory internally. It will stay there. Here's an interesting one. Even though we're talking about landscapes, this is kind of a specific area that is an interesting question. Someone asked, how do you meter for shooting planes at an air show? Since the camera seems to meter for the sky and leave the plane very dark. Obviously, it depends where the sun is. If the sun is over one of your shoulders or behind you, and you spot meter for a bright cloud, then your plane should be good. If you've got a bright blue sky, however, a camera meter is probably going to try to bring that down and make that its middle gray, which is going to make the subject dark. Again, it comes down to what's the important piece of the scene. Now maybe you've got a darker plane, maybe the plane's black, and you still want to capture detail on it. In that case, you might have to do a little bit of subjective metering, and it might require a little bit of testing. You might find that overexposing a stop is going to be the best answer. Obviously, if the sun is in front of you, you have a whole different world, and then you're going to have to really adjust for that. So it's something that's going to come with a little bit of experience, depends on the color of the airplane and the position of the sun. So if you can position yourself so that the planes have the sun behind you or over one of your shoulders, meter for a bright cloud, use the spot metering mode, it's going to give you a good result. If it's just a bright blue sky, then what I would probably do is go to the incident mode, and I'd probably cheat a little bit and open up probably a stop. Give that a try. I think you'll be happy with that. Let's see. Someone said, Joe, my highlight alert now does not mean my highlights are blown out. It may or may not. You need to look at that alert in combination with the histogram. If your camera has the ability to show you the red, green, and blue histogram on your display, you want to see if all three of them are up against that right wall. If they are not, you're not blown out. The highlight warning comes on very early. So it's an alert, but it's not necessarily meaning that you're blown out. You have to combine that with looking at all three histograms. Let's see, what else do we have here? Someone asked about dome in versus dome out. All right, just real quickly. Again, we're talking about landscape metering. Dome in and dome out is going to depend on how directional is the light. Generally for landscape metering, I'm going to leave the dome out. Where I put the dome in is when I'm in studio and I'm measuring individual lights. So I'll just retract the dome, and if I have multiple lights in the studio and I want to find the contribution of each light, then I'll put the dome in, pointed at each light. But generally for landscape, my dome pretty much stays out. Let's see. So for those of you that have, excuse me, very detailed questions about the 758, I'm not going to go into that today. The 758, if the question is, can the 758 do something? Chances are the answer is yes. The 758 can do an amazing amount of things. Yes, it can average different readings. It can figure out where your highlight's going to clip and your shadow's going to clip and show you all that on a graph. We're not going into that level of detail today. Today is more metering techniques for landscapes. Lastly, let's see, one more. Someone asks, why was my raw file of the falls bland? And did I boost the clarity, saturation, and contrast in Lightroom? The answer to that is yes, and I'm going to address that. It's going to be the last piece that we address today, because it's important to understand that a correct exposure of a very high dynamic range or very wide tonal range scene is not going to look good in your camera because of the camera's tonal curve and how it records color. We're going to address that in a bit. So let's get back to the spot metering for a second. Now, one of the keys to really taking advantage of the 758DR spot metering capabilities is knowing the dynamic range of your camera, meaning the tonal range that your camera is capable of recording in a single shot. I'm not going to go into the DTS software. In fact, we'll have Jen post a link if you want to get into the details of how to do that. But what that allows you to do is to find out what your camera is capable of. You can then program that information into the DR just with adding a USB cable, and you'll easily know then which details will be properly imaged and which will be over or under the range of your camera. Now, this is what Sekonic's DTS software does. It teaches your meter how your camera sees and measures light. In fact, let's take a look at a graph here just for a second. This is actually the DTS screen with the graph for my camera, which is a Sony Alpha 99. Now, what it does tell me that's very interesting is the complete tonal range of my camera, along with some safety clipping margins. And you can see from this graph that this particular camera is capable of capturing, I think it's 3.3 stops up before there's any clipping danger, and 3.4 stops down. This is a lot of tonal range. This camera has an incredible amount of range, which is why I love it so much for landscape photography. Now, you don't have to use the DTS software, but it does give you the best information, and it allows you to squeeze the most tonal range possible without clipping any important details, and it does show you on the meter where that's happening. Now, even if you don't go through the DTS software, I don't want to scare you off, you don't have to do it. I'll show you a safe and manual way that will get you pretty close. And once you have this information, then you can make exposure decisions that are going to take advantage of your camera's capabilities, and that will give you greater tonality and clarity than you've ever seen before. Now, there are different techniques for metering, as we've seen. We've got spot, we've got incident, and there's even a couple more. In fact, I have a couple of tools here. I've got an X-Rite 18% gray card, and also I have an X-Rite color checker passport, which you might have noticed was color just a minute ago, right here. This allows me to create custom camera profiles, which will have all my colors snap into place, but there's also a Sekonic version of this, and we'll show you how to get one if you don't have one, that has an 18% gray card added to it. So let's take one more trip out to the park, and we're going to see the results from 3 different methods of metering the same scene. This is one of those places, beautiful to photograph, but gives your cameras fits. It's also kind of a difficult spot to meter, so let's go over a couple different techniques here. Now, we're down to 100 ISO because it's a bright, sunny area, but if you look behind me, you can see the challenges. Really deep green forest, deep kind of gray-blue water, and a really bright sky. And depending on where I point my camera, if I go by the camera's meter, it's going to be all over the place. So let's try a couple different techniques with the 758. Now again, 100 ISO, I'm at 125th of a second. Now, I'm in the same light as the scene out there, so I can just meter right here. However, if I hold it up here, I get f13, but I've got a real specular bright spot on my dome because the sun is really high in the sky. So what I really need to do is kind of just bring my hand over so it casts a shadow on the dome, getting rid of that bright spot on the sun, take my reading, and I get f8. So that's a big difference. That's a stop and a third. f8 to 9 to 10 to 11 to 13. That's 1 1/3 stops. That's a big exposure difference. So let's go ahead and put f8 125 in the camera, and I'm going to take a shot. So that actually gave me what seems to be an absolutely perfect exposure. Let's see what the camera says. I'm going to point the camera out here and see what I've got from metering. And the camera tells me f13 is a good exposure for out there. I'm kind of doubting that, so let's go ahead and take one. And yeah, the sky looks okay, but the shadows in the trees have just gotten way too dark. And the problem is, depending on how I frame, where I put the horizon, I'm going to get a different exposure number. So let's go ahead. I'm going to point down. When I point down, I'm back to f10, where I've got more of the lake. If I go in the middle, f13. If I put the horizon at the bottom third and include more sky, I'm up to f16. And according to the camera, those are all correct exposures. Well, it can't be the case. One of them's got to be perfect. And f8, what it did was, it really put the highlights right to the right. So with that in mind, let's go back to the meter and do the spot metering to the brightest part of the clouds and open up 2.5 stops from there and then see what that tells us. So I switched to spot metering. Again, I'm at 125 at 100 ISO. I'm going to scan around the clouds, see what I get that's very bright. And it looks like f25 is the brightest thing I'm getting in the clouds. And again, we certainly don't want to put our clouds in that middle gray. So I hold in my ISO 2 button to get my 2.5 stops, and it comes back. And to put the clouds right to the right, it says f10. Okay, probably a better result than that f8. That f8 might have been pushing my highlights a little bit close to the right. However, 2.5 stops on this camera is very safe. I know from the calibration I've done for this camera that I can actually open up 3.5 stops to push it to the right. The 2.5 stops is a real big safety margin. So let me go ahead and do f10, 125, reframe, and wherever I point, I'm just going to stay at that f10. And it gives me a perfect exposure. Now, not all of you have spot meters. Yet. You want one of these. You want one of these. This is a very cool tool. Let me show you another way to do this. Really great tool to have. Really simple, $40 or $50, 18% gray card made by X-Rite. It's a 4x6 card, very small, easy to carry around. If you don't have a spot meter, you can also use this with your camera. But if you do have a spot meter, it gives you a great reference for doing any kind of landscape work. Now, I've got the sun illuminating those cliffs over there, so I want to make sure my card is in the same light as those cliffs. I've got the sun coming here, so I want the sun to illuminate the card. So I'm just going to hold the card out in the same light the scene's in, take a reading, and f9. We're actually splitting the difference to what we had before between that f8 and the f10. Let me take one more. And yeah, f9 it's saying. So exactly splitting the difference. I put f9 in the camera, and that's another way to get that really perfect exposure. Take my shot at f9. And lovely. Now again, understand that what you see on your display is showing you how the file's been captured as a raw file, but it's not showing you the potential. What we're after is capturing the best digital capture We're going to know because of the contrast curve of the scene in front, we're going to make some adjustments in software later. But we want to have the most tonal range from highlight to shadow, and don't go by necessarily what you see in here. Now, one other way to do this, if you don't have a meter, remember, you got to buy a meter. You want a meter, it just makes this easier. This same card, because I know the question's going to come up. Well, can I just put my camera in spot metering mode and meter off of this card? The answer is yes, you can. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to spot meter off of here. And by the way, when you do spot metering, you only have to fill the center of the frame. You don't have to fill the entire frame. F9, same exact result. A couple of reasons for that. One, this meter is calibrated to the camera. It knows exactly what this camera thinks middle gray is. So as expected, it's giving me the exact same result. So rather than looking through your camera, seeing a different result for everywhere you point, spot meter off a gray card out in the same light that your scene's in. Your exposure will be perfect. Once again, no chimping, no bracketing. It's not necessary. Do this, you've got a perfect exposure. So you just saw 3 different ways to meter the same scene, all of which are valid, all of which gave us readings within 1/3 of a stop of each other. And that's the kind of consistency you're after. Actually, watching that video, it really was 4 methods, wasn't it? First of all, 1, incident metering with the dome protected from the direct sun. Again, just putting my hand up over the dome, bringing it away, but getting rid of that little specular dot on the dome. 2, spot metering that brightest highlight and then opening up 2.5 stops from that result. In fact, someone asked a question where I did the ISO 2 button. Again, a detail of the meter that if you watch the previous webinar we'll go over, but I do have the ISO 2 programmed as an exposure compensation, and I have it set for 2.5 stops for that kind of metering. And that gives me the result exactly immediately. 3, spot metering off of an 18% gray card with the meter. And that's what I did. Here's the X-Rite gray card. And I could also do that with the Color Checker Passport with the gray card. And then lastly, spot metering off the gray card using the camera's internal meter. And someone asked a question, what metering mode was my camera in? Is it in center weighted, spot, matrix, etc.? My camera meter was on spot metering, so it was only reading the center of the card. And by the way, when you go to spot meter, what the camera is using is pretty much basically that little center focusing dot. That's what it's doing there. So a couple more questions. Someone asked, they understand that the higher end meters have a lot of flexibility. Is there any advantage to using a lower end meter like the Sekonic 308 compared to just using in-camera metering? And the answer to that is yes, because there's one huge difference of using a handheld meter versus your camera meter, and that's its ability to measure incident light. Again, what incident light is, it's the light falling on the subject. It doesn't care what color the subject is. It doesn't care how light or dark it is. It's measuring the light falling on the subject, and it's giving you that number to put that amount of light in the middle. The incident meter is finding your middle. The camera, as powerful as the metering systems are in these cameras, they're still influenced by what they're pointing at. They're reflected light meters. If you're looking at something that's very dark, again, the camera wants everything, as I said earlier, the camera wants everything to look like this. It's going to take all that information in front of it and make it a middle gray. So if your scene is very dark, it's going to end up overexposing. If your scene is very light, it's going to underexpose. If any of you have ever tried to take a picture out in the snow using your camera's meter without adjusting, it took that snow and it made it gray, didn't it? So that's the advantage of any incident metering. Let's see, oh, here's a good one. Someone said, actually 2 of you asked that, can you meter for night skies and how easy is it to do? That's a 2-part answer. The answer is yes. But again, remember that a meter, when you take a reading, whatever you point it at, it's putting that element as middle gray. You then have to figure out where does it need to go. So maybe the answer is to close down a couple of stops. That's going to require a little bit more exploration, and it's also a bit of a teaser because we're working on a program for shooting at night and night metering and some astrophotography, so stay tuned for that. Another question, someone said when I say F10 or F8, am I in aperture priority mode or manual mode? For me, I am always in manual mode. It's the only way I shoot. So everything for me is going to be dialed in. Someone asked that they see the color checker has 2 shades of gray on it. What is the difference? All right, so this one right here, this is designed to be your middle gray, your 18% gray. Technically, it's actually a smidge darker, but that's what it's used for. This one that looks much lighter is actually, it's a very light gray. It's almost a white. This is actually for white balance. It's a spectrally neutral, very light gray, almost white card that you use to do custom white balance in camera or for later. So that's what the 2 of these are for. Let's see, what last? Let's do one more before we continue. Someone said they just joined the webinar. They shoot a lot of sunsets and sunrise, and they just bought a 758. Good for you, because you might have seen me. Once you start using one of these, you really want it. Metering sunrises and sunsets is kind of a little bit different world. Again, it takes a little bit of experience because you need to evaluate the scene. For me, this is my way of doing it. Generally, when I meter a sunrise or sunset, particularly when the sun is just starting, maybe just starting to appear, the way I meter is to hold the meter out parallel to the ground and do an incident reading, and I generally find that works for me. It's going to depend a little bit of what's going on in the sky, depends on how high the sun is, but generally that's my method. The other thing you can do is, if you get really good at this, with your eye, you can usually evaluate what element in the scene do you think should be in the middle? What element kind of matches that 18% gray? You can take a spot meter off of that element, and that will put that element right in the middle. That takes a little bit more of experience, but you might find that it works as well. Now, someone said, how is 18% gray middle gray? Middle gray would be 50%, wouldn't it? Yeah, that is a confusing term. When they say middle gray or 18% gray, it's not 18% gray in a scale of like 0 to 255. It's 18% gray in its amount of reflectance. It reflects back 18% of the light. That's where the 18% number comes from. As far as a number, middle gray percentage 0 to 100, if you say you were dealing with Photoshop, I'm not going to go into the technical details. You can read entire white papers on this. It's actually slightly under 50% is the way it's calculated out. But a good question. It does get confusing. All right, let's continue on. So in that last shoot, we did 4 different methods, and all of them produced really pretty good results in that scene. So why is that? Well, each method returned a correct middle gray for the scene, and in this case, there weren't any extreme bright highlights to be worried about. There were clouds, but again, it's something with evaluating with your eye. I could see that, yes, there were white clouds, but they actually weren't an extreme amount brighter than the surrounding blue sky. And this comes to evaluating the light in the scene and having a sense also of your camera's capabilities. Now, continuing on, if you're not comfortable with making that kind of evaluation, then what I'd recommend is going with the spot metering technique of the brightest detail you want to capture, and then opening up your exposure as we just saw. You can always trust the meter to give you the best information and produce that kind of perfect digital file. But wait, the image on my camera's LCD looks kind of flat and lifeless. So what happened? Now, for a bunch of reasons, your camera has trouble recording high contrast scenes with the same contrast curve and tonality that our eyes are capable of. So this means some post-processing and software. Don't let this scare you. Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, if you use Photoshop or Photoshop Elements, can help you get a beautiful image as long as the file is captured correctly. You need to understand that your eyes are constantly remeasuring a scene when you look at it. It's kind of like constant HDR, where your camera has a fixed contrast curve and it has a fixed color temperature. So what I've done is I've prepared a quick demo by processing a couple of files from this shoot, one with Lightroom and then one with Adobe Camera Raw. It's actually very easy, it's very powerful, and you can make these edits in less than a minute. Another cool feature of using these applications is that if you take a bunch of shots under the same conditions, once you do an edit to one file, you can apply that edit to all of them with the synchronize button, and just in one click have your entire shoot pretty much edited. So let's take a look at that. So let's take a look at editing in Lightroom, and then we'll move on to Photoshop. Now, here's one of our images from Minnewaska State Park, and the image looks kind of flat. But if we look up in the upper right-hand side in Lightroom here at the histogram, we can see we've got full data all the way from blacks almost to a pure white. So the digital file was captured perfectly. So I mentioned this is going to be a quick edit. This isn't meant to be a tutorial in Lightroom, but let's take a look. So obviously our highlights are a little too light here. The image is lacking contrast, so let's take a look at some of the sliders. Exposure is perfect for now. We may want to adjust it after we do our other sliders. But first, let's bring down the highlights a little bit. Just to take a little of the kind of the sting out of the bright whites, we're going to open up the shadows a little bit. And what this image really needs is the clarity slider, and this works really well in landscapes. That was maybe a little too much right about there, and then we'll bring up both the vibrance, which increases the blues and the greens, generally the cooler colors, and then we'll add some saturation as well. So we bring that slider up, and that quickly we're in pretty good shape. Now we've got something else going on here. And that is we've got one color temperature for our image where we've got shade here and sun here. So the color temperatures end up being different. So one other last fix I'm going to do for this image is bring up the graduated tool here. And I'm going to put a graduation in this foreground. And what I'm after is the color temperature. I want to put it back to a cooler color that will reflect how the scene really looked to our eyes. And right there looks great. Last thing I did in this image was, since there wasn't a whole lot going on in the very foreground and a little bit in the sky, I did a quick crop on it, and we had our image that was pretty much done. So in fact, I'm going to go ahead and reset this so you can see where we started, and then I'll show you our finished image, and here we go. So there's our final image with the crop, our clarity and our saturation, and we've got a beautiful shot. In fact, let's go full screen so we can see it a little better. So what this is showing is the data was all there in the file. We just need to do our adjustments post to bring back that digital file the way our eyes saw the image. Let's do the same thing to an image now using Photoshop. In this case, we're actually in Adobe Camera Raw. And it's a very similar process to what we just saw in Lightroom. So let's go back to the Basics panel. And again, we can look at the histogram and see in the upper right-hand corner here, we've really got a good histogram. So we need to make adjustments. The shadows need to be opened way up in this particular image. So I'm going to open them up, almost to the full 100%. And I'm going to bring the highlights down some. So again, before I do anything else, I'm going to go right to my clarity slider and add a lot to that. That's helping define the local contrast. This image is going to need a lot of vibrance because the cloud cover started getting a little heavier. And then some overall saturation. Looking better already. There's a couple other fine points I do want to do while I'm here. First of all, horrors, I've got a spot up there. So let me go to my spot removal tool. I'm going to put a radius in right around 10 or so. And just click, and I have it set for heal. The software will find an appropriate spot and get rid of that. So here we're back at the main menu. What else do we need to do? The image still needs a little bit of oomph. Now I could increase the contrast a little bit. That helps a little. I'm also going to open up the exposure just a little bit. But what I really need to do is actually bring out the blues and greens a little more. And to do that, I'm going to go up here, which is the Use Saturation and Luminance slider. Now in Lightroom, you have a little targeted adjustment tool right in this window. In Adobe Camera Raw, you have to go get it, and it's up here. So we click on that, and the first thing I want to do is increase the saturation of the blues. So I click on the Saturation tab here, go to the blues, and if I drag up, it increases the saturation of the blues. By the way, if I drag way down, I actually can make it black and white, which is kind of interesting, but not what we're after today. So I'm going to add some to the blues, and then I'm going to click in the greens while I'm here and add some saturation to that as well. And if you look at the sliders over in the menu, you'll see that they move. Some greens and yellows are moving. And that's looking much better. Now, if you go under Lens Effects, there's also something I like to do here. And that's to add a little bit of vignette to my landscapes. I find it just adds a little bit of centering interest. Now, I could bring this way down and it becomes obvious. What I like to do is just come down a little bit, less than 10 points typically, and you can barely even notice it. But what it has the effect of doing is kind of recentering you on the image. Lastly, I'm going to bring up the crop tool. I want to take a little bit of the sky off the top because there's not much going there, and I want to add a little bit more balance to the image. Hit return there, and that's looking a heck of a lot better. In fact, if we go ahead and reset this, which I can do from here. So take a look at that. I'm going to reset it, and then we'll go see the file opened in Photoshop. So if I go ahead and reset this, you can see where we started. So that's where we started. And if we go into Photoshop, we get to see our final file. And let's go full screen with that so you can see better. And we get a beautiful image out of that. With the cropping, we've now got a nice kind of rule of thirds where the horizon's on the top third. Went from a really bland file that was correctly captured into an image that has stunning colors and a much different mood. So I hope I made it kind of clear that really you can get very close to being a finished file very quickly. It really, if I made it look too easy, it really is easy. I'll be doing some programs that go into much detail in Lightroom and Photoshop later, but for now, really those quick amount of sliders that I did, they will get you there. Now, a couple more questions. Someone asked, what do I mean when I say chimping? And chimping is kind of the term that people use when you take a shot, you look at the back of the camera, take a shot, look at the back of the camera. Mostly because, and I think it's because when people do that, they say ooh. So you're going ooh, 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 and that's where the chimping thing comes from. Not a good idea, however, because understand that your camera's LCD is not the most accurate representation of your image. It will tell you if something really bad happened, like the shutter didn't open or whatever, it's completely dark, or if maybe a framing issue, there's something sticking out of somebody's head in the background. But for exposure, not a good idea to judge an image just on your LCD alone. Someone asked about doing HDR shooting and metering with the 758. That really is a subject all of its own, and I have already done a couple of webinars on that. I understand Jen in the chat room, if you take a look there, she put a link to where you can find the webinars on HDR metering. Someone asked, when I said opening up 2 stops, am I saying increase from f8 to f10 or f8 to 6.3? Now, first of all, f8 to f10 is only 2/3 of a stop. Remember, your camera is adjusted by default in thirds of a stop. So full stops are, if we start at f8 and close down from that, f8 to f11 is 1 stop, f11 to f16 is 2 stops. So if I wanted to close down 2 stops, I'd go from f8 to f16. If I wanted to go 2.5 stops, well, your camera's in thirds, so it's going to be around f20, because the next stop up would be f22. Opening up, f8 to 5.6 is 1 stop, to 4 is 2 stops, to 2.8 is 3 stops. But your camera has those intermediate third stops. So when I take that highlight reading, and look through here with my spot meter, and I take my brightest measurement, I want to put that on the right, because that reading is taking that brightest white that I've got and making it middle gray. Well, I don't want it middle gray, I want it off to the right. So when I say open up 2.5 stops, if that reading was, say, f8, and I wanted to do it with aperture, I would have to open up 2.5 stops. So 5.6, 4, and somewhere between 4 and 2.8, probably 3.2. Typically with landscapes, you don't want to do that. Typically you do it with shutter speed instead. So if I was at 500th of a second and I needed to open up 2.5 stops, 250 would be 1 stop, 125 would be 2 stops, 60 would be 3 stops. So somewhere 80, 90, 100th of a second is going to be that 2.5 stop opening. So that's where kind of learning what the f-stops mean will really help. Someone asked, can you use this for a wedding shooting? And the answer is absolutely. You could use it both with its incident modes, again, just keeping the sun off the dome. I do that a lot of times, especially if I have somebody backlit. I'll use a meter like this because we all know the bride's face is the most important. And I'll meter right under the bride's chin back to the camera. If you've got a bride in bright sun, she's got a beautiful white dress, and you don't want to blow out that detail, then you can go right to the spot metering and treat that dress as if it was that bright cloud. Take a reading, open up 2.5 stops, and you're good to go. Let's see, so someone asked what slider needs to be adjusted to make the clouds pop. When you're in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, you're going to find the clarity slider is really going to increase that. What clarity does is it increases areas of local contrast. So if it's got something darker next to something lighter, it will increase the contrast just in those local areas. Someone asked, they said, there seems to be a difference in the 18% gray if you look at a Kodak card, a color checker passport, and a few others when they're next to each other. And the answer is yes. Sometimes it's not as much a reflectivity issue as it is a color difference. The Kodak card, while it was an 18% gray standard for many years, was not particularly good for color because it actually had a little bit of a tint to it. I've found them to be generally a little bit blue. So if you're going for exposure, that was one thing. If you're going for color, that's something else. The new color checker passports are both. They're completely spectrally neutral, and they're going to give you the correct exposure. So that's why I like using those. Let's see, anything else before we continue on? Oh, someone asked if you synchronize your shots, like when we're doing this editing in either of those softwares, can you have the software change the file names so that you still retain the original image? Understand that in both of those softwares, we're dealing with the raw files. The raw files always remain inviolate. You can't actually do anything to the raw file. In both Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw, in Adobe Camera Raw, once you open the file in Photoshop or in Elements, then it gets converted from a RAW into whatever file you've chosen, typically a PSD file or a TIFF or a JPEG. In Lightroom, that doesn't happen until you export the file. When you export it, you then tell it what file form do you want it in, but you always retain your raw file. You also have the advantage in Lightroom of creating kind of a virtual copy if you want to be able to see your untouched RAW next to your edited RAW. But remember, while you're in Lightroom, the files are always in RAW. They don't change until you actually send them out. So let's kind of sum up what we've seen. When you capture the best possible digital file, then you've got the best starting point to create the best print. Learning how to then take that file and process it allows you to recreate the beauty of the scene that inspired you to take it in the first place. Now that's going to be it for today, but there's a lot more coming. You think, how much metering stuff can we do? But I've got something really cool planned for you. In our next session, we're going to look at capturing the passage of time in both pastoral and urban settings. This will include tips and gear to capture flowing water to create that dreamy, silky flow. Then to contrast the flowing waters, I'll then take you on a visit to New York City, and we'll see how some famous spots like Times Square and Grand Central Station have their own flow as the camera records single shots, and I did some of these up to 10 minutes long. Now let's, Jen, if you'd go back to the waterfall shot for a second. So here's an example. This is Dingman's Falls in eastern Pennsylvania. A lot of fun, and this is about a 30-second exposure. Now in the city shots, which I just did the other night, Tuesday night, they're intriguing and sometimes even a bit eerie. For example, when I did Grand Central Station for 10 minutes and almost everybody disappeared except for a few people who really stood in the same place for a long time. So stay tuned. We'll send out the invite for this webinar, which is going to take place next month, so keep a lookout for that. So again, that's it for today. Our thanks again to Sekonic for sponsoring us. Love the questions today. Thank you so much for the great questions. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your interest. So until next time, keep shooting, keep experimenting, keep learning, and be well. See you again soon. Bye-bye.